Boris Mouravieff, Gnosis, Book 3, Part 3, The Life, Chapter 2. The Adamic man, who has even a vague consciousness of his real I, finds that this is a source of internal conflict that he cannot resolve on a purely human plane. This conflict becomes more acute from the moment he actively enters esoteric work. It is then that he becomes weak and falls a prey to uncertainty, doubt, and mistrust towards himself. For the road that leads to truth always passes through doubts. Throughout this work, we have seen several times the considerable sum of efforts and super-efforts that are demanded of the Adamic man, who, after having recognized his real position in life, resolutely crosses the first threshold and climbs the staircase to attain and pass the second threshold with its promised redemption. Pre-adamics are not subject to these fits of anguish and these permanent inner conflicts. Not that they live in perfect peace or are never troubled by conflicts, far from it, but in most cases their conflicts take place in the interior of the personality, between different groups of the little I's which produce these conflicts. As a result, the character of their conflicts is purely psychic, and they are generally resolved by some kind of compromise. The more acute conflicts that take place in pre-adamic man occur between the I of the personality and the I of the body. We have dwelt at length on this subject in Volume 2 of Gnosis, emphasizing the fact that the I of the body usually wins over the weak, changing personality, which capitulates without much of a struggle whenever it is a question of satisfying the stomach or the sexual appetites. Justification is then sought in slogans, such as those which allow us to think that it is normal to act like everyone else, or in a maze of paradoxical reasons that are simply lies to oneself. But the inner conflicts of Adamic man, who often enters esoteric work because he has reached the last extremity of moral bankruptcy, cannot be resolved by compromise, as there is no place for this kind of solution in the consciousness of the real I from which he receives his calls. In him, it is the ensemble formed by the entire personality with the I of the body, an ensemble which, directly or indirectly, is often made to act by the sexual centre, which flees from the voice of conscience, that is, of the real I. He then has a choice, either to obey his real I and triumph over himself, or to flee from this invisible combat into self-calming and the powerful illusions offered by a life of lying to himself. In every case, if he triumphs over himself, which is what will enable the Adamic man to resolve the inner conflict of the moment, this will inevitably involve a modification of his attitude towards outer life. Generally, the result will be conflict with those closest to him, unless the latter follow him step by step in his esoteric evolution, which is rare. This does not mean that those who are near and dear to him wish him any ill. On the contrary, it is nearly always his good that they have in view. The conflict arises simply from their different conceptions of what is real. If those who surround the individual in question are pre-adamic, they could never agree with him, being incapable of understanding the reasons for his change of attitude and unable to grasp the nature of the ends he pursues. They will therefore automatically become instruments of the general law, which makes sure that those who step out of line are brought back to the fold. This is how a man's foes shall be those of his own household. Pre-adamic man, as we said, cannot be subject to inner or domestic conflicts of this kind. He rarely receives B influences. If he vaguely senses their existence, they only appear as a curiosity to his eyes, and do not have the power to trouble him right to the depths of his psyche. In him, the sexual center reigns supreme, whether by its direct action that takes the form of carnal love, or by an indirect psychological action of the psyche to which his personality submits. Like Adamic man, his personality contains the 3 lower centers, but that is all. Equally underdeveloped and unbalanced, but sheltered from the troubles provoked by B influences, this personality lives and acts obedient to the commands of the sexual center. Nothing in him withstands the latter, which is known in contemporary language as temperament. In the arena of the exterior life of human society, dominated by A influences, the Adamic man who has crossed the first threshold proves to be weaker than his pre-Adamic counterpart, just as good seeds sowed on ploughed land are weaker than tares, and the greater the strength he acquires during his progress on the staircase, the greater is his weakness when faced with life. This was the main reason why monasteries existed, so that the monks or nuns could be sheltered from exterior life. But now greenhouse cultivation is outmoded. What is needed today is cultivation in the open air, entirely exposed to the elements. However, let the sincere, untiring, and useful worker know that he will receive the means to protect himself against these storms. Pre-Adamic man does not reincarnate. Not having any individualized element in himself, in the esoteric sense, he is born and dies, but he does not incarnate, and consequently he cannot reincarnate. He can be hylic or psychic, but not pneumatic, since he does not have the breath of life in him, which is manifested in Adamic nature through the medium of his real I, which can be realized or potential. The individualization of pre-adamics is collective and is directed in groups by certain spirits of the hierarchy of which we have spoken above. This does not, however, prevent pre-adamics from entering the evolutionary field that forms the films of adamics in great numbers, and adamics suffer from a lack of discernment. They suffer from a lack of discernment because of their corrupt state. This disturbs and sometimes slows their evolution. As we have seen already, because of the principle of equilibrium, humanity on this earth is divided into 2 equal parts, Adamics and Pre-adamics. The equilibrium between them is automatically adjusted to follow fluctuations of the incarnations of Adamic souls. However, if the Adamic race, by casting its pells to the swine, denies its divine nature to an inadmissible degree, this balance will be broken in favor of the tares. In the parable of the talents, Jesus foresaw the possibility of such a degeneration, where the slave buried the 1 talent entrusted to him, and, on returning it to his master without having made it multiply, was told, "Thou wicked and slothful servant, and cast ye the unprofitable servant into outer darkness, there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Is there any need to emphasize the esoteric meaning of this terrible penalty? We have seen that when creation took place, the two humanities were placed under different authorities. Essentially created with organic life on Earth, in the note La of the second cosmic octave, pre-adamics come under the absolute three. Essentially created in the note of C on the same octave and receiving the breath of life of the mission of the Adamics was to govern organic life on behalf of the absolute two and under its direct authority. The fall necessitated a new beginning, and God provided for this through purgatory, which is represented by the staircase between the two thresholds. From then on, like the man of the sixth day, subject to the law of birth and death, Adamic man appeared on the earth below the first threshold. He has kept a dim consciousness of the real I, in spite of the almost complete obstruction of his channel of communication with the higher centers which still exist in him, and this still gives him the possibility of a choice. If he hears the voice of the Master and resolutely steps onto the staircase, and if he reaches the fourth step and resists the trial by fire, then, when he crosses the second threshold, he will be welcomed as a prodigal son by the Absolute Two himself. If the Adamics en masse abandon the combat that leads to redemption, and if this desertion goes beyond the tolerance allowed, the good seed could be progressively stifled by the tares, since for cosmic reasons the general potential of organic life on Earth must be maintained in any circumstance. The world would then go straight towards catastrophe, which this time would take the form of a deluge of fire. On the other hand, if the equilibrium, which is already jeopardized, were re-established, then, with the integral and simultaneous incarnation of Adamic souls, the time of transition would end and humanity would enter the era of the Holy Spirit. Then would follow 1,000 years consecrated to the perfecting of the two races, and after a second millennium, the reign of the androgyne, the last judgment, would definitively separate the tares from the good seed. The latter, by integrally regaining the note C of the second cosmic octave, and now inspired by the breath, would then enter the bosom of the Lord to undertake higher evolution, and at last attain the pleroma. The tares of yesterday would cease to be tares. Promoted to the rank of good seed, they would begin the long evolutionary course that the Adamics would have already covered. Then they in their turn would receive the higher centers of consciousness, which, given them in potential, would be the talents that they must make fruitful. We must add that the Adamics who had previously degenerated into pre-adamics would have the possibility of taking up their abandoned evolution again, while an equivalent number of the most able pre-adamics would receive the talents that were initially given to the former, and this would help them leap forward on the road of esoteric evolution. They may be compared with gifted, hard-working students who get a double promotion while the incapable and lazy ones do another year in the same class. But in this case, one can fail only once. When we consider this leap forward, it would be useful to meditate upon the parable of the unjust steward, a clever man in the domain of the A influences, who knew how to find a new point of application for his cleverness with good timing. However, apart from rare periods and rare exceptions, characterized by the direct intervention here below of higher forces coming from the Absolute Two, the faithful stewards of the Absolute Three generally occupy an important position in the different groups and layers of human society. It would, nevertheless, be impossible to give any precise indications that would enable Adamics at the level of men 1, 2, and 3 to objectively recognize pre-adamics, because the latter are also men 1, 2, and 3, with the sole difference that they have no possibility of individual esoteric evolution. Thus, as long as the higher centers in Adamic man remain in a lethargic state, he will be without the psychic instrument by which he could objectively recognize his pre-Adamic counterpart, so that society remains mixed. Therefore, it is only with the approach of the era of the Holy Spirit and the appearance of the new man that the progressive formation of a new elite in all groups of human society will end the chaotic state from the esoteric point of view in which humanity has found itself since the fall of Adam. Meanwhile, the two races are totally mixed. Not only nations, but even families can be, and generally are, composed of both human types. This state of things is the belated result of transgressing the biblical prohibition against mixed marriages, because of the beauty of the daughters of pre-adamics. The dominant position of the pre-adamics, that is a result of the esoteric failure of the adamics, is now creating a critical situation of unprecedented gravity. The remainder of the time of transition offers the last chance for humanity to re-establish the threatened equilibrium and to avoid general cataclysm. If we do not take this opportunity, the tradition of Solomon will finally overcome the tradition of David. That is, it will overcome the Christian tradition in the planetary sense of this term. Then, deflected from the Absolute Two, and even going beyond the limits of what is necessary and useful in the mission of the Absolute Three, in the deification of the personality, the false prophets and their followers, thinking that they are right, will hurl pre-Adamic humanity, the children of this world, against the Adamics, the children of light, and will provoke a final, frightful, and useless struggle. If this should happen, and if then the new Adamic elite does not manage to quell the revolt against the love of the Absolute Two, and, paradoxically, against the authority of the Absolute Three, a resistance that would ensure victory, the balance will finally be broken, and humanity will be destroyed in the deluge of fire.